I want to take this time to go over some of my stances on capitalism and why I think the African mode of production is superior. In my recent video, I stated that capitalism should absolutely not be idealized by African people when it comes to the implementation of economics in our reality. Now, most of the time when you see someone mixing a capitalist effort with save the race language, they're a scammer. And we don't have to go deep into miscreants like the hidden hairline and the fecal brain assimilationists to prove this. What exactly do I mean when I say capitalism should not be idealized over our own economic structures? Well, let's get into the specific definition of capitalism. Capitalism is private control of the means of production by an ownership class for profit. Capitalism is not the same thing as commerce. Commerce, or the exchange of goods and services, has existed since the beginning of human cultures. Feudalism, the slave mode of production, the tributary mode of production, and the African mode of production all have commerce. Capitalist commerce is specifically that which is primarily controlled and directed by the owners of industry for profit. Though modern neoliberal theorists champion the role of a completely free and unfettered market, Adam Smith, the grandfather of capitalism, stood against rent-seeking and envisioned the state as a primary role in the structuring and procurement of a nation's wealth and income. Capitalism is also not the same as businesses or currencies, since all economic systems have both units of production and mediums of exchange. Oftentimes, those who support capitalism try to associate it with the universal features seen in all economies, and this is absolutely not valid. This gets into a lot of the confusing Western terminologies, because Adam Smith, who is one of the major founders of capitalist thought, was considered a classical liberal. And in the modern Western political economy, conservatives who are much closer to classical liberalism when it comes to economics are juxtaposed against liberals who are progressive and trend towards the economic left. Both of these Western traditions in the political right and the political left are two sides of the same coin. Charles Mills, in his text Racial Contract, documents how the founding ideologues of liberalism completely excluded black people from their conception of human beings being deserving of unalienable rights. This stance still exists today in conventional politics, where left-leaning parties and right-leaning parties use black voters as pawns in their political game of chess. In the American context, both major parties receive capital funding from billionaires, whether it's Sheldon Adelson on the right or George Soros on the left. And this goes back to my previous point. Capitalism is absolutely not meant to benefit everybody. It is meant to benefit the ownership class and requires a large amount of poor workers who do the job of the owners. Capitalism creates a minority of rich people and a majority of poor people. This is an objective historical fact. There has never been a time in history where capitalism has benefited everybody because it was never meant to. It has always been meant for the winners. Now that brings us to my next point. Can black people be capitalists? Yes and no, and I will explain why. It is obvious that black people in the modern global economy own capital and industries. There are numerous examples of this. Black billionaires from Michael Jordan to Aliko Dangote validate this fact. However, from a historical perspective, capitalism as a social formation that is an outgrowth of feudalism through mercantilism was built upon a desire of Europeans to enforce their colonial regimes on a planetary scale. The work of great scholars such as John Henry Clark and Dr. Eric Williams have revealed how the international enslavement of black people was at the foundation of the composition of capital in the modern world. At the onset of capitalism, the most valuable commodities were enslaved Africans. One could argue that the entrepreneurial efforts of men like Tipu Tip and women like Madame Tinubu in taking advantage of the demand for labor by European colonies and building massive amounts of wealth for themselves represent the most pristine emanations of black capitalism in the modern world. Some of their descendants today still benefit from the wealth they earned from collaborating with imperialist powers. This leads me to my next point. Can we honestly criticize entrepreneurs like Madame Tinubu and Tipu Tip for taking advantage of an ever-growing market when their endeavors laid the framework for a modern economy that produced the likes of billionaires, black billionaires like Byron Allen and Jay-Z? These men are celebrated by black people for their entrepreneurial success in defying the odds in a racist society. My position is that it is completely hypocritical to castigate African slave traders while celebrating the economic success of modern black capitalists who benefited from the historical processes that they established in helping develop nations like the United States, the most successful capitalist nation in the world. Without the collaboration of African slave traders, there would be no United States. If the goal is to accept the capitalist system as it is, we should accept everything else that comes with it, in the good, bad, and the ugly. If capitalism is universal and meant to last forever in perpetuity, then maybe it is the case that black middle class and the black working class are meant to serve the wealth-building objectives of the black elite. Yes, it is true that capitalism has pulled more people out of poverty if we consider African societies and civilizations as universally poor in comparison to those in Europe. This is especially the case if one considers the development of the Western world at the expense of African territorial states who opposed their imperial expansion for centuries. If we completely ignore the fact that Africa had its own indigenous systems of wealth building and commerce prior to the slave trade, and that the economic warfare perpetuated by European states that led to the mass genocide of African people, along with the long-rooted connections of Max Weber's Protestant ethic in the Faustian effort by Europeans to colonize the world, then it is absolutely true that capitalism has pulled more people out of poverty than any other economic system. However, if we examine the true nature of the African mode of production, we find examples of wealth building that far exceeded the capacity of modern capitalist economies. Mansa Musa, who is known as the richest man of all time, was a byproduct of the Malian variant of the AMP. According to the research of Dr. Chirukuri, large economies and immense wealth was built by African societies through long-distance intra-African trade that passed through riverine and lacustrine systems. This completely refutes the erroneous claims by Dr. Thomas Sowell, rooted in the baseless proposition of geographic determinism that implies that pre-colonial Africa was underdeveloped due to the lack of navigable rivers. If this was the case, there would be no such thing as civilizations like Ouagadougou, Songhai, or Oyo. Now let's compare and contrast the AMP and capitalism based upon some basic elements that we can observe. In African economies, public wealth reserves were mandatory. There were enforced market obligations to maintain cultural ties between different populations. Products were a reflection of personal character and required to be made with perfected quality. Customers were to be found among the trustworthy, with an obligation on vendors to satisfy the needs of the customer. And finally, labor was pulled together to ensure the economic productivity of all sectors of the economy. On the flip side, in free market capitalism, there are no wealth reserves, no obligation to maintain cultural ties, and the weight of determining what product is good or bad ultimately falls on the consumer. Cultural trust has little to no impact on who can sell to who, and the productive process is controlled privately and directed via profit interest. Now, some could argue that the protectivist nature of African economies at the macro and micro level led to their ultimate destruction by Europeans during slavery. This would not be accurate due to the fact that vestiges of the African mode of production exist in modern Africa from the continent and also in the diaspora, from the Jangi structure of the Bamileke of West Cameroon to the Quilombos of Brazil, and even the unitary state of Henri Christophe in Haiti. Dr. Amos Wilson viewed the Jangi system of West Cameroon as something that African people all over the world could emulate due to its nature as an analog to a rotating savings and credit association and generalized labor institution. The Jangi helped the Bamileke compete head-to-head against French imperialists economically during the colonial period and played a very prominent role in financing the Cameroonian Liberation War. Dr. Amos Wilson saw that traditional African financial approaches like the Jangwi must be applied to our modern economic reality in order to advance black societies. According to Dr. Amos Wilson, black people do not suffer from a lack of money, but from the absence of an African-centered economic system. Money is not a system. It is what it is. A system involves the systematic and organized utilization and distribution of money. Without the pattern, system, or organization, one does not have an economy. An economy exists prior to money, and there were economies in the world prior to the invention of money. Dr. Amos Wilson continues, "There is not a black bank in existence. Anytime you have a bank regulated by another race of people and by the rules of another race, it is not yours. You are just there. I can show you where the presence of black banks has retarded black economic development. Other groups move into economic existence and control before they build a bank. After they build an economic base, then you'll see them build a bank, and not the other way around. Only dominated people who don't know themselves do things backwards." In Wilson's view, African-centered economic councils on the local, statewide, national, and international level could be utilized to manage all economic interactions through communitarian, retail, and service outlets. Also, distribution centers, a raw materials development center, and financial sector, as well as an import and export sector to connect the continent to the diaspora, could be managed by these councils. The power of such development can be exemplified if one analyzes the evolutionary trajectory of black businesses in the United States from mutual aid societies and then evolving into cooperative insurance institutions and finally businesses. The UNIA is the most famous example of an institution based upon horizontally managed auxiliaries that mirror the fundamental unit of production in African societies. Dr. Lloyd Hogan's analysis of diasporic African mode of production economies emphasizes social production as opposed to profit. He defines a political economy as human populations undergoing social reproduction within a bounded geographical domain under rules enforced by a political state. People are the central focus, and their labor drives the political economic system. 6 parameters of political economic analysis include geographic space, human population, institutional mechanisms of social reproduction, historical period, political state, and external geographical domains. Social reproduction requires the creation and maintenance of the population through institutional mechanisms. Human labor consists of 2 alternating phases: external labor, which creates the material means of survival, and internal labor, which generates human energy and the reproduction of the population itself. Distributive mechanisms ensure the flow of human energy from internal labor to external labor and the distribution of material goods in the opposite direction. Accumulated wealth, characteristic of the historical epoch, serves as the switching mechanism to restart the cycle of labor and maintain the political economy. Hogan's research reveals the necessity of maintaining a universal safety net, or what the Garveyites envisioned as a racial trust grounded in the creation of a black laboring population aligned with the principle of human perfectibility, or everyone striving to do the best and be the best for the collective at large. In the pursuit of economic empowerment and liberation, African-centered economies are a viable alternative to the dominant capitalist system. Through the Afrikan Mode of Production, African people can reclaim cultural identity by emphasizing communal cooperation and interdependence to empower individuals and promote self-determination. African-centered economies prioritize intelligent resource management and challenge the narrow definition of success and prosperity in the Western world. By embracing these principles, black communities can redefine economic success and foster global African solidarity. Ultimately, the Afrikan Mode of Production offers a legitimate pathway for black empowerment rooted in heritage, community, and sustainable prosperity.